All right. We are live on YouTube and Facebook, and we will also, Tavia, be uploaded for people to be able to get our podcast, which is
Yeah.
Connections with Tavia and The McClish, shortly on, I think, iTunes and Spotify. Is that right?
So currently we are up and running on Spotify and working out some kinks with iTunes right now. It was on a call with them this morning. So a lot of people use Spotify. So our first episode is uploaded to Spotify. You can find us there, Connections with Tavia and the McClish.
Right. And this is a really special day for a number of reasons. Before we even started this, our guest today, it's amazing that she's joining us, and we are really extremely pleased that she'll be here. She was somebody that we felt really strongly about having on because this sort of was the underpinning of our entire podcast. That for both of us, it means a lot, and it means a lot for the people that'll listen now and in the future. But particularly this week, I just, we lost someone who, frankly, I really wasn't aware of, Stephen Twitch Boss, who was part of the Ellen DeGeneres show, and he was on So You Think You Can Dance, and unbelievably talented human being. I got myself up to speed after seeing the information about his passing by suicide this week, and I just thought, wow. I mean, I watched a video that he and his wife had put together of them dancing at the holiday, and he left behind three small children, and I just thought, oh, what makes something like that happen? What makes someone who's so uber talented feel that that's something that's necessary? And I think that our entire underpinning of the show is to talk about how there's so much judgment, and there's so much shame, and there's so much guilt that creates a stigma and a taboo in society, that we have to hide these things. We have to bury them, right? We can't talk about it. And we just talked last week about all these family secrets that people have, right? I mean, you can't talk about that. It's secret. And those are the things that keep topics like what we're going to talk about today in the dark, which only perpetuates the problem. It perpetuates people not having the tools to understand what to do when they're faced with something like that, and to have a different sense about the topic in general, and dealing with family members, with friends, with loved ones that are working through issues like that. And I mean, Tavia, you and I have talked a lot about the fact that if you have a broken bone, if you have a piece of bone sticking out of your arm, you're going to have people surrounding you, taking you to the emergency room. You're going to get a cast. People will send you flowers and, bring you gifts and sign your cast and sort of surround you with support, right? Both emotional and physical. Uh, but that's physical health. But once you look at the issue of mental health, that creates a completely different imprimatur. So if you or someone you know or love has an issue that you can't see because there's not a bone sticking out of your skin, there's not something physically wrong, there's no blood coming out, but it's something that's emotional, that's when you realize how much darkness and ignorance surrounds the process. And it's really scary. It's sad, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we're here to take the shame off of this subject, because so many people um, have lost someone to suicide, or they themselves have had suicidal thoughts or attempted. And we're here to hold space and to talk about how dark things can get. And again, when we share and we open up with somebody that is a safe person, we are able to create connection with them, and it really can make a world of difference.
Right. And so our guest, Ann Moss Rogers, she lost her son, Charles Aubrey Rogers, back in June 2015. And I mean, we'll find out from Ann Moss, but she has written books like Diary of a Broken Mind, A Mother's Story, A Son's Suicide, and The Haunting Lyrics He Left Behind. And this in particular, I think about with this passing of Twitch, and we'll talk with Ann Moss about Charles Aubrey, but he was such a creative genius. And I think sometimes when we talk about these issues, we forget to really highlight the person we're talking about, because this young man is, I mean, was truly a creative genius. So uh, but Ann Moss took the approach of, rather than marinating in the stew that I think a lot of people tend to, where you allow yourself to become enshrouded and ensconced in this feeling of shame, of guilt, of being afraid to talk about it. And conversely, everyone else is afraid to talk about it. She decided to take a different approach. And instead of saying, why did this happen to me? I think it's fair to say she took the approach of, why did this happen for me and for others? And took the approach of a warrior, and has taken the warrior's approach to this to say, I want to stop one more incident of this happening as we go forward, because, she, I think, had the strength and courage that a lot of people would find it difficult to do. So without further ado, let's bring on Ann Moss Rogers. Hi, Ann Moss. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. I'm in Virginia, and thank you for having me on the show today to discuss such an important topic.
It is a pleasure to have you here today, Ann Moss. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so welcome.
I hope you heard when we started, I was talking about Twitch, and I don't know if you know who that is. I didn't know.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but think about the synchronicity with you being on today to talk about Charles Aubrey, and looking at someone like Twitch and thinking, wow, I mean, when you have that kind of creative genius, and your son, I mean, the lyrics, the music, the rap, there's such a genius to the words. I mean, I've listened to I guess all of his works, and I was just struck by that. Like, yeah, I mean, most people could not put that together.
Right. He was able to put into words what so many others felt, and that
Right.
was what drew a lot of people to him, and why he was so popular. He was really good at listening to people, and he really cared about them, and they understood that. But those notebooks where he wrote the lyrics would often walk away because somebody would feel like, I need to have that. That's my survival guide.
Right.
And it took me a really long time to recognize that and not be resentful of it.
Of course. Well, could we start off by, basically painting the picture of your family and Charles Aubrey, and how things started off with him and your older son, and just kind of paint the picture for how that, because I know that Tavia and I mean, we really want other people to connect with their own family circumstances and understand that
Right.
they don't have to be in fear of, gosh, it's just us, right? But, how
Right.
did things look with him growing up? And this creative genius, I know it started early. So you saw things like that early on with him, right?
I did. And like by the time Charles was 3 years old, he was starting to read. His brother would bring things home from kindergarten, and he was reading them. And it took me a while to realize, I thought, oh, he's just looking at the pictures, and nobody was reading it. It was like, oh, there are no pictures in these little things. See, he's telling these stories. He's actually reading the words. And both Richard and Charles were bright in very different ways. Richard had a lot of creativity, but he also had a lot of left brain, sort of math and science. Charles was really good at the science, but he just hated the math, especially when letters were introduced. He's like, no, math is supposed to be numbers. What about these letters doing in it? And he did, like me, he just did not take to math, but he could write, and he was a great storyteller. He was magnificent on stage, and he constantly had this revolving door of friends. my best friend, my best friend. And he really only had one best friend, but there were so many people that sort of got that label on a regular basis. He was always in motion. He never slept well, starting at the age of about 18 months. He had a sleep disorder called delayed sleep phase syndrome. And that we could never really get our arms around, which was really disturbing to have a 10-year-old that just didn't fall asleep at the end of the day because he had like run himself into the ground.
Right, right.
So, for many years, I thought it was kind of like he was trying to just stay up all night and didn't want to give up on the day, before I really realized there is something going on. And I think his brain just lit up at night. And he would later on use that time to write. And then later on, he would use that time to write. And then he would do drugs and alcohol because he started to struggle with thoughts of suicide around middle school. Prior to that, in elementary school, we saw signs of anxiety. He wasn't prepared for class, even though they went over and over again what you're supposed to do. And he really wasn't bonding with schools because by then the school had become this, test taking, let's stuff the kids and pour content all over them and make them take a test. Well, that's not Charles's gig. I mean, he wanted to act out a book report. That sort of thing was what he was good at. Kind of taking the real critical thinking, things that challenged him, and that pour content and spit it out on an exam just wasn't his gig. So middle school, we started to see some other issues. And it was in his sophomore year that he started to regularly misuse alcohol and marijuana. And marijuana, in his case, as in a lot of kids under the age of 28, it triggered some psychosis. And we didn't know if this was mental health or drug related. And we certainly weren't getting a lot of help. And we would go get help for the mental health part. And they'd say, well, he has to stop doing the drugs. Then we would go for the substance misuse and like, well, he's too young. We don't have but one program. And then you do the one program. It was just this constant catch-22, like, oh no, he has to go get this fixed first. Meanwhile, my son is struggling with thoughts of suicide. And so he uses drugs and alcohol to numb those feelings.
Right.
Because guess what? We're trying, but nobody else is really talking about it, for one thing. And they're not giving us any coping strategies, and they're really not helping us as parents. Yeah. We were seeing a counselor. He was seeing a counselor. We end up doing kidnapping our son out of his bed and taking him to a wilderness program. And you don't do that because you've caught your kid with a beer and a joint.
It has to be pretty extreme, right?
It does. I mean, you do that because you think your child's life is at risk. That's when he started to really, really write prolifically. And, he was in the middle of the woods, away from drugs and alcohol. So that was his coping strategy. He had used it before, but now it was on the main stage. And he just got stacks and stacks of notebooks. He ends up going to therapeutic boarding school. After that, it's in wilderness that he's finally diagnosed with depression, cannabis dependence, which is daily use of marijuana to try to manage everything.
Right.
And anxiety and depression. So we've never even gotten a diagnosis. And I had asked for that multiple times. Still, no one ever mentions suicide. I had asked in 2 different mental health sessions, and they just glazed over it when I asked. I mean, I acted like it never came out of my mouth. And I was like, what's the answer? And they just ignored it. And I think that's because they only get 1 hour training in social work schools. So he would come home in 2014, having spent some 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. And that wasn't plan A, right? You don't really want to give up normal and going to high school games and seeing your kid in the stands or, at a game, to send them away in the middle of nowhere. But when he came back, I thought he would start using some of the coping strategies that he had learned. Instead, he went back to drugs and alcohol because he still had the thoughts of suicide that we still didn't know about. And he eventually becomes addicted to heroin. He, at some point, he asked for help. And I mean, that was like the greatest day of my life when he says, I need help.
Right.
And we took him to detox and rehab, and he ends up going to a recovery house. He relapses there within 24 hours. They take him back to detox. On the way there, they take him to a private hospital to have him evaluated for suicide risk. And they refused to do it because they didn't evaluate those people, meaning my son.
Right.
I think I froze there for a minute.
Yep. You're good.
Sorry about that. And he goes into the detox place. He sees a friend of his, and instead of staying checked in, they both walk out together because they just wanted one more party,
Right,
just
right.
one more party and we'll go back. And he just didn't go back. And at this point, we don't know where he is. And we would later find out he was in sort of a trap house apartment, not somewhere I would want my son to be. And then we're sitting in a police car in a parking lot after going out to dinner one night. The police had called us and said they were going to meet us in the parking lot. And I'm like, what is this about? And that's where they delivered the news that my son had died. And we didn't know it was a suicide at first. But when my husband asked that question, the policeman told us the actual method, and that method left no question.
Right.
I didn't get it. I'm like, our child grew up in a house of love. He knew we loved him. Why would he do this to us? And over the years, I've understood that Charles didn't do this to us. He did it to himself in a moment of extreme despair.
Exactly.
He thought he was a burden. He thought the world and our family would be better off without him. And he felt like garbage because he had become addicted to heroin. And people treated him like garbage. And therefore, that feeling became internalized. And so he took his life, and it really took me years to understand why, and then understand also that there would be a lot of unanswered questions, and then I would have to live with that.
Right. One of the things that struck me about him was early on, this was a child who was extremely empathetic. I recall that he actually identified something on your tongue that wasn't right, where you
He
actually,
did.
yeah, what was that about? I mean, no one else had noticed this, obviously, right? I mean, you were around a lot of
Right.
people, and he saw that. I found that
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah, and there had been something weird in my mouth that I couldn't identify with it. I think I keep kind of freezing. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I am directly connected. So
How old
anyway,
was he when this happened, by the way? He was
3 years old.
3 years old. This is
He's
amazing.
3 years old. He wanted to take his first shower. And he came in the bathroom, I'm going to take my first shower because daddy takes showers and I'm not a baby anymore.
And his big brother, right.
Oh yeah, big brother. I'm not going to take a bath anymore. But he thought he could take his candy in the shower and eat it. And of course you can't do that. So I said, you need to put your candy on the counter. And he goes, Mom, you really like gummy bears. I know you're going to eat them. And I said, I'm not going to eat them. But you can't take the shot. I said, it'll ruin your candy. You don't want that to happen. So he goes in the shower and he comes out. The first thing he looks at, he says, you ate some of my gummies. And I said, I didn't. And he goes, stick out your tongue. And I stuck out my tongue and he goes, stick it out all the way. And I said, it is out all the way. And he goes, it's crooked. And I said, what do you mean it's crooked? And he goes, Mom, look in the mirror, it's crooked. I go look in the mirror and he's right. My tongue is crooked. So I kind of got to get him dried off and dressed and all that. And I go back I called my husband up. I'm like, get him dressed. I need to address something. And I'm looking in the mirror and I'm like, it's paralyzed on the left-hand side. That can't be good. Well, it's, 9:00 on, I think it's Sunday night. There's nothing I can do about it right then. So I thought, well, maybe it has to do with that dental surgery that I had. I go to bed that night. I wake up at 3 a.m. and I thought, oh my gosh, I remember where it's one of the cranial nerves. It's got to be a brain tumor. And I went to the doctor immediately and, process actually had an MRI by the next night. And by the next day, they called and told me the news that I had a brain tumor. And it was my 3-year-old that brought my attention to it. I mean, he saved my life.
Right. Well, I know.
Amazing.
And that's what's incredible about the story.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean, all the other people, all these other people that you're surrounded by and nobody noticed that, but your 3-year-old, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Not my dentist, not my periodontist, even me. And I'm like, what's going on in my mouth? I'm looking at my gums. I'm pushing my tongue aside. I'm doing all sorts of things. I can't figure out what's different because I'd never just said, well, let me stick out my tongue.
And I had a question regarding you telling your story of the past and trying to communicate with the professionals about Charles and him being suicidal. It was clear that he was suicidal and
Yes.
Everybody was glazing over you and him and not addressing it. Do you think that if people had addressed it head on, that the outcome would have been different?
I can't put that on them, but I can
Right.
say it would have been on my radar. It wasn't on my radar. I did get a last phone call from my son. And I remember hearing the despair, but because nobody ever said, they said he was high risk, but they never described or explained what that meant. So I was in the dark. And I'm feeling this despair. I don't have a bucket to put it in because it doesn't exist. It's not on my radar. And I think I would have known if they had told me anything, that, if they had told me he was a suicide risk and they read it in his music. I know they saw it. They just never leveled with me. And I still resent that. But I can't say it would have changed the outcome, but I think
Right.
it would have helped.
Yeah, we
for me
can't.
to know.
Yeah, we can't say that for sure. I mean, there's been, I mean, in my own personal experience, I completely openly communicated, and somebody was opening up to me and sharing that they were having suicidal thoughts. And this person ultimately ended up taking their life. And so I think that and that was my brother, my brother
Oh.
Aaron. And so, but I think we got to at least try and have the conversation and have the open, honest conversations about it and take this shame off of suicide, because a lot of people are having suicidal thoughts, and a lot of
They
people have
are.
attempted, and life gets messy and it gets dark, and we need to have a safe place to go to process all of these emotions. And instead of trying to sweep it under the rug and not talk about it and glaze over it. And so, I mean, that's one of our efforts here is Tom and I are trying to take the shame off of it and create that safe space for people.
Well, I completely agree. And one thing I want everyone here to understand, the greatest gift you can offer another human being is allowing them to feel heard without judgment
Yeah,
and without fixing.
absolutely.
We all want to say, "Oh, you have so much to live for." But when you say that, you are not meeting them where they are. They're in a place of darkness and despair, and people are fearful about sitting with somebody in their tragedy and their darkness. But that's what bonds us. That's what connects us. That, that can be like a beautiful moment. And I don't think we should push those moments away. I think we should embrace them. And having that conversation with somebody is as easy as saying, "Tell me more. I'm listening." And not saying, "You have so much to live for," or "You need to just pray on it," or "You're just trying to get attention." And by the way, yes, when somebody is struggling, just like if they're having a heart attack, their brain is being attacked, they need attention, and we should give it to them because it is an emergency. It is a life and death, and
Right.
they deserve it. Every human deserves that.
I know a lot of people out there say, I don't know what to say to somebody when they're really hurt and when they're really sharing this emotion, and I don't know how to be there for them and comfort them. Well, we can actually ask, do you need me to just hold space for you and just be present and be silent? Would you like me to offer something to you, remind you of your wonderful qualities, talk this through with you? You could just ask that question, what would you prefer? I wish somebody had asked me that at times, and I could have just been like, can you just hold space for me? Can we just be here and just be? That would be wonderful right now. So,
Sitting with somebody in their darkness, in their tragedy is really difficult because we as human beings, we want to fix it. And if we can't fix it, we avoid it. We run for the exits when what we really need to do is offer, and your presence is enough. That's what people
yes,
don't understand.
yes, it is. We've been talking a lot about that, Ann Moss. We've been talking a lot about presence. My brother Aaron actually said that to me right before he took his life. He said, my gift to you today, Tavia, is my presence. And I said, it is a gift. Thank you. So thank you for highlighting that right now. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm so glad you shared that memory. What a gift that was to you, Tavia.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Moss, reading the your book, Diary of a Broken Mind, and looking at some other things, there was a theme that struck me throughout, which was a sense of, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a sense of disempowerment as you began this journey through the system that I think you referenced earlier was sort of very cold and sterile towards the needs that Charles Aubrey had as an individual. And I mean, we schools, it seems like they tend to look at kids as, cattle, right? So everybody's got to go in this one direction and have minimum score results on tests and all that. So I guess because I know there's a lot of people that feel this sense of overwhelm when they have different issues, whatever they might be with their kids. And looking back now, what would you recommend to people that feel overwhelmed and disempowered by the system?
I think one of the most important things is to find support for yourself. And when I talk to parents, they want me to fix it and give them a 1, 2, 3 fix. And I'm like, you're in this for the long haul. And you need to find support for yourself because you
Yes.
need to be in recovery as well.
Yes.
Because there are things you may be saying or doing that isn't inspiring their recovery, and not because you're not a great parent. It's because we weren't born with an instruction manual on how to deal with this. Most of us also were raised sort of in a authoritarian sort of parenting environment, when what we really need to be is sort of a wisdom guide. And we need to be like asking more questions, listening more, and lecturing less. And as far as schools, I've seen a big change in schools because that's where they're seeing the suicides and then having to deal with them. So they can no longer ignore them, and they're not for the most part. So communities and government money has sprung up in the last few years. Where I see a huge gap is with our licensed clinical social workers and the social work schools. They're not teaching, suicide risk assessments and safety planning. So I've started to actually team up with Dr. Kim O'Brien, and we're actually teaching those courses. We're teaching one in Richmond in May, and we'll do one online in March. That's not completely solidified, but we need to give our social workers the tools that they have not been granted before to do this work, because we can no longer ignore this mental health crisis and the fact that 20% of high school students wanted to take their life last year, seriously considered suicide.
Right.
We can't ignore that.
How many was that?
Almost 20%. That's a lot of kids.
That's unfathomable. It's unfathomable.
Yeah. That was before the pandemic. That statistic was for 2019. So we don't have the results of the Behavioral Youth Risk Survey. It's every 2 years. And we don't have the results for that, but those were the results in 2019, before the pandemic, before actually, it sort of put the foot on the accelerator for mental health and suicide issues, or at least feeling suicidal. And we know that while it is tapered for older white men, it's actually going up for young people. And that's just really, really sad. We can't have that happen in this country.
No, but it's becoming much more ubiquitous, to a point that something has to happen. And as I mentioned earlier about you being a warrior, I mean, we really have to have more warriors to get people to understand they have the ability to empower themselves, right? Because there is a feeling in these institutions that, listen, you mentioned authoritarian. When you're in the school or you're within this institution, we are in control and you need to follow our guide. But in fact, there has to be empowerment for people to understand that they can take action themselves. They don't have to just follow what someone says, right?
Right. So I think the biggest issue with young people is underdeveloped coping skills. And it's not because they were born and this generation just, is just weaker. There's obviously something going on in our culture. Mm-hmm. And I think when the digital age moved in, that which we thought would bring us together kind of pushed us apart. For one thing, kids got fewer opportunities to learn the coping strategies that we used to learn on the playground. And so I used to learn a lot of those, playing dodgeball with my neighbors. And now there have 40 to 50% less face time. So that's half as much time to develop those skills. Number two, with the digital age, is that kids are feeling more insignificant. And that's a theme that I started seeing really strongly over the last 2 years, is that I had this neighborhood of 13 kids, and it wasn't feeling overwhelming with that hierarchy. But when you're talking about millions and billions of people, and you start to feel like a grain of sand on a beach, you start to feel like, what do I matter? You know, or they do some accomplishment and they go on YouTube and there's somebody doing it, you know, there's 12 other people doing it and much better than they are. So you just feel like, well, why should I even try? So we have to understand that our kids are growing up in a completely different environment than maybe we grew up in, and appreciating all the challenges that go with that instead of just dismissing their feelings. I visited a high school group the other day. That was the number one thing they said, is that, well, my parents really don't get it. They're really not listening to me. They don't think anything I say is important, and they act like dictators. I heard that over and over, and that's why I ask that question when I go in to do these workshops. What's the one thing you wish your parent knew about you? That's one of my favorite exercises because they reveal so much. It's also pretty funny because they reveal some funny things too. But it's really given me a lot of insight as to where their angst comes from, and how it can lead and get them in crisis. And we want to prevent them from getting to crisis.
Well, I was curious about Charles Aubrey in relation to, because it struck me from all this, that he was very social and had a lot of friends that he felt were friends, and had connections that, a lot of us probably had hoped we had growing up, right? I mean, he was very popular. So
Yeah.
I'm just curious about maybe where some of his angst came from, even though he outwardly had the appearance of having a number of friends. I'm curious your thoughts on him personally, where there might have been some angst that he wasn't getting what he needed, or was it just that feeling of insignificance on YouTube when he went on?
I think it was Charles never felt fully satiated or filled up. And I think it was just this craving and this need. And the reason he had people, and oh my gosh, he was constantly, can so-and-so's dinner, spend the night, or, somebody's got to cook and make and get the stuff, and, be 5 o'clock. I'm like, I'm not prepared to feed 3 extra kids tonight, especially 15-year-olds. Oh my gosh.
I know it. Oh my gosh.
The last, and he wanted everybody to spend the night. He was constantly begging for people to come over. I would find out later, and he would hint at it. But I didn't ask enough questions because I didn't know to. He wanted to be surrounded by people at all hours because he was afraid of what he would do to himself when he was alone, especially at night. And so it was fear for him. What we usually see is people ghosting and isolating. And then people take it personally. Oh, she hadn't even returned my text. She must be mad at me. It ain't she's mad at you. Something is not right in her life. And he or she is isolating. That's a big one. So if you know someone who's ghosting, reach out and don't give up. Another one is anger. People will get angry and irritable. People who are depressed or in despair, males especially, will express that as being mad because that's acceptable in society. Being sad as a male is frowned upon, which I don't get that, but it is the way it is, and we need to change that perspective. So Charles was hypersocial, not real typical. Usually it's ghosting or anger, and then you might see the sad kid. I mean, that's the portrait that everybody puts in front of you. But so when somebody is isolating, let's say that there's a child who's kind of pushing away their family, but they're engaging with their friends. That's normal teenage behavior. When they're isolating from friends and family, and they haven't done that before, that's a red flag. So it's a slight distinction, but it's an important one.
And Moss, you had written a book called Emotionally Naked, A Teacher's Guide to Preventing Suicide and Recognizing Students at Risk. And again, it strikes me that there's such a lack of that information and knowledge in schools. And how have you found that? I mean, if people embrace that as far as schools, as far as teachers and that community and understanding the need for that information, I mean, how have you found getting that out there?
I'll say that it's been really hard to market that second book. And, I think I wish they'd allowed us to put educator instead of just teacher, because it really is for all educators. But the overall concept is focusing on student wellness as being your sort of mission, because emotionally healthy kids perform better, right?
Right.
And so if you focus on scores, you think you're going to get good scores. But that's not actually true. If you focus on emotional wellness, the side effect is going to be phenomenal scores. So I really think we need to start embedding those social emotional learning, also basically life skills, into the teaching curriculum itself. And the book just really gives you a lot of examples of that, of what other teachers have done, mostly teachers that have struggled with the death of a student by suicide and just flip the script on their teaching. Okay, I have to teach this material, but I don't have to deliver it lecture style. I can deliver it this way. And if I do it this way, then I am, the kids are working together. They're, building connection and belonging. I'm promoting the fact that reaching out for help is okay. We're collaborating as students, and they're developing coping strategies because they're thinking about it more. So there was a Spanish teacher in Kansas who does this Dear Abby assignment. They have to write it in Spanish, some problem they've dealt with, like they're sending it to Dear Abby. She codes them, she sends them around the room. The other kids handwrite their advice. So automatically they're thinking, how to solve these problems. And that's what we need to start to trigger, because those are the skills they take forward for the rest of their life. Not algebra, 1 to 2% may take that forward in some engineering program. But most kids, most everyone is going to use life skills. And we need to start teaching those now, like feeling our feelings. Our kids and a lot of adults don't know that they need to feel their feelings. I mean, pushing them away or numbing them with drugs and alcohol. You got to feel them. That's what they're there for.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely stress this with my 8-year-old son, and Moss, the importance of feeling everything. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be frustrated. Embrace it and let's move through it. Let's process it and let's see how we can process this in a healthy way and channel that for our highest good. And so, but I see that there's a lot of like, oh, let's not go there. Let's not feel this way. Let's move on. Let's dismiss this. And that's not honoring ourselves and each other in any way. And I want to go back to like the fulfillment as well, because, I'm a strong believer that if we are filling ourselves up, if we feel connected to ourselves, and we are able to create greater connection with others and have fulfilling connection and fulfilling relationships with other people, really honing in on that and what that looks like. We're in such a time right now where we are constantly looking for fulfillment from the outside and satisfaction from the outside. And we just keep searching, and then we're on this hamster wheel. And it's like you just find yourself at the end of the day depleted, empty, and going to bed. And you're just like, what's the point? What's the point of being here? What's the point of even existing? I don't have any connection with myself. I feel empty inside. I don't have connection with others. It's a really sad and lonely place that again, goes to this path of depression and can lead to suicide. Again, so
Yeah.
how do we encourage all of us, not our youth, everybody? I mean, I recently heard that there was a child as young as 5 years old who was having suicidal thoughts
Yeah.
and attempting to take their life.
We
That's
lost a 5-year-old in Virginia over the pandemic to suicide. 5.
so
That's
how do we really encourage, not in our youth? Yes, it's important, and for older people, and
Definitely.
every age, every age, it's important. If we're starting to learn now, fantastic. How do we learn how to start fulfilling ourselves, lifting
Well,
ourselves up?
the first thing we have to do is we have to focus on the basics. We have to get
Yeah.
enough sleep. We
Yes.
have to not be eating donut holes all day, but eating a nutritious diet.
Yeah.
So just
Yeah.
like it says on the back of the cereal box, eating a balanced meal,
Yeah.
getting enough sleep, that's the foundation
Yes.
of it all.
Yes.
And then the next step is our relationships. So I want to isolate. We got to employ something called opposite action, which is a DBT skill, which is dialectical behavioral therapy skill. I didn't want to go to support group after I lost my son. I made myself go. Never regretted it. Never regretted it when I made myself go, when everything else was like, I'm tired of just want to sink in the sofa and isolate, but I needed to talk about it. And I always came back so fulfilled. So make that date with a friend, with your support group, and keep at it. So someone's busy, they cancel. That happens a lot these days. It's not personal. It is happening to us all. Happens to me all the time. I do not give up. I connect with people. I go out to tea. I go out to coffee. I work in my home. So I have to make sure I have those opportunities to connect with other human beings, and not just online, but in person, sitting somewhere, really bonding with another human being. We must start to do that. We've got to do those first 2 steps. Then we can focus on ourself and whatever issue we have. And you can take agency for your own mental health. You do not have to just wait for your therapist appointment. You can listen to podcasts that talk about the strategies. And there are so many. I mean, Marsha Lineman has a whole series on YouTube on the dialectical behavioral therapy skills. And there is a strategy that suits everyone. And start with awareness and education, and then look up those strategies and do them and figure out a way to document it, whether that's journaling, video, audio, some way to kind of make you feel that progress. And I think those are the basics for preventing yourself from getting to crisis. Now, some people are kind of born with this brain in crisis that's sort of always on fire. And there are books for that too. There are books about living with a suicidal mind, and, how do we live with that? How do we understand that those thoughts don't need to become action? I think we need to take agency of our own mental health sometimes. And I think we just really a therapist is great. Therapy support is wonderful. But we also need to understand we need to do that work, more than 1 hour a week with our therapist.
Absolutely.
We need to be doing that work all the time.
Moment to moment living. Absolutely. Yeah.
And those intense feelings that you feel like you can't live through, 60 to 90 seconds. That's how long they last.
Yes. I've timed it.
Yeah.
I've timed it. And one of our upcoming guests, he's 15 years old, and he says feelings are temporary.
All temporary.
they're temporary. So just give yourself some time to move through it and then move on and then do a creative outlet.
Right. And
Seek a
he's
creative
exactly right.
Yeah.
It is taking that time and sitting with it, pausing with it,
Yeah.
reflecting on it. Then once that feeling lifts, you know, or at least is momentarily alleviated, then you can go and distract yourself. But give your time to sit with that emotion first and no denying it. And then you can distract yourself. That's perfectly okay. But a lot of times people go right into distraction or try to push it away. And it's going to come back like a boomerang on steroids. So you got to give it, you know, there was no way I was going to get over the grief of my son in a month. It was a very intense 3 to 4 year process to just be able to live again and want to live again and want to, you know, to be able to thrive. It took that long, and it took the real dedication to that, and being surrounded with other people who were trying to go for that same goal.
And Moss, I have a question going back a little bit in time when things were really at a apex as far as the addiction and some of these behaviors, and so you're in the midst of this overwhelm. When you, as a family, decided to send him to this wilderness program, again, and to help people that are, because I've known people that have done this before. What are your thoughts on that as sort of that? I don't know if that was something that you looked at as a last ditch effort, or if it was just had to happen to help create those coping skills. But in hindsight, I was curious as to what you thought about it.
I'll be really honest with you. I have no idea. I still don't, to this day, have any idea if that's something we should have done. I can tell you that I wish I had picked a different therapeutic boarding school if he was going to go, one that was a little kinder to the students. It was a desperate move to save our child's life. And there are parents out there trying to make the decision now, do I send my child to an inpatient program? And they're struggling with it, and they're thinking, well, then they're going to be around other people who are thinking about that. And am I perpetuating those thoughts? And that's just a really hard call. Lots of times, the kid themselves will say, I need to go away. So I know at one point, I won't name her name here, but Charles's girlfriend knew she was addicted and asked her parents to send her to a program out in California. I am so proud of her for that. I mean, she was only like 17 when she asked to do that. That's really remarkable.
Yeah.
That she said, I need this help. And she did it. She did it, and she followed through with it. And I think that's incredible. And we went back and forth. I mean, we just really had no other choice. But I can tell you what I wish we had never heard the words tough love, because that's a myth. You know, at tough love, oh, we haven't tried tough love, we need to do that. Never withdraw love, ever. Never withdraw love. And I would never tell my loved one who's struggling with an addiction or a mental health issue that, well, when you get better, you know, that doesn't mean they have to live with you. It just means that, you know, as much as I want you to get well, I love you even if you don't. And I think our loved ones really need to hear that. They need to know that even at their imperfect selves, if nothing changes, that you still love them, you know, and you're not making their recovery contingent on getting your love back, which is using it as a weapon.
Well, Tavia and I were talking about that yesterday about, how you create boundaries in a situation like this,
Yeah.
where you're conveying that depth of love, but also saying that you have to protect yourself and your family from you know, the terror of what's happening, right? And the
Right.
so and
Those
that's
those
tough.
those boundaries are always shifting. And there's really only one rule I've kept through anybody helping anybody with substance use disorder. I never give somebody with substance use disorder a direct amount of money. So we were helping a guy named Chris for many years, and he relapsed and came back to the house, and he asked for money, and I said, Chris, that's our boundary, but what do you need? And he goes, well, I need bus and I need this. And I said, here's what I can do. I can send you a bus pass. I can send you groceries once a month.
Mhm.
I can meet you for lunch. And he goes, okay, that's what I need. So
Right.
I figured out a way to keep that boundary, because a lot of times if you just give someone who is using money, well, you know what it's going to go for. And that doesn't make us feel good. And then a lot of people will argue with that. Say, well, you know, they got to live, and if they're not using, they won't live, you know, and all that. That was my boundary, is I'm not going to give money. I didn't want Charles to live with me. He did ask to come back at some point and live in our house. We were selling it, so we were packing up the house. There was no place for him. I mean, there was no bed to sleep in. And I didn't know what to do with them. So we were paying for the recovery house, because
Mhm.
I didn't know what a heroin addiction was about. And of course he was going to manipulate me, because I am terribly naive about this sort of stuff. And I feel like he didn't understand that I did love him still. And I regret that, but I have forgiven myself for that. So just the question of should you kick your adult child out of the house or not is fraught with so many pros and cons. And you just have to make the best decision for you and your family, because being in that chaos every single day is so difficult. And I would never ask a family to do that. And I would never turn around and criticize the family that said, well, he's using, but he's not violent. And I want to make sure he or she is safe. So, you know, he does stay at my home. And I'm not going to criticize either family. But you make the boundaries on what you personally can live with. And there are services that do that. There are stream communities, for example, based on the craft model. If you have a child with an addiction issue, there is NAMI support groups for families if you live with a child with mental illness. And in our case, we had both going on. So I didn't use both of those because I didn't know about them.
Yeah.
Right.
What would you say to those that are listening? And you kind of answered this, but I just want to be really clear with the listeners. Let's say that you are in a relationship with somebody and your partner is suicidal. This partner is expressing, I am suicidal. Things are getting very dark, but they're also being very abusive. They could be abusive, like physically, emotionally, whatever. And the person, the other partner on the other side of this, is conflicted, wanting to take care of themselves, their well-being, whether they have children or not. I mean, you know, you're wanting to take care of yourself, but you're also like having compassion for this person who is suicidal and is like obviously reaching out for help. You know, we know when people are saying that they're suicidal and they are reaching out for help. So, but they're also, you know, in this very destructive, unhealthy relationship. They're getting abuse. There's manipulation going on. I mean, the whole thing, right? How do we support those people that are in those tough situations?
So you've got to take care of yourself and your family first.
Yeah.
That if
Mhm.
somebody's being abusive, you've got to get yourself out of that situation first. And it could happen before you completely get out of it. but you've got to put on your oxygen mask
Yeah.
first before you can help others. And if it's as simple as taking them to the emergency room, and getting an evaluation, that could work, but it depends on the level of abuse and manipulation, and weighing which, if he goes down this road and I do this, he will beat me to death.
Yeah.
You need to get out and let that person figure it out, or call for a welfare check.
Right.
But you need to take care of yourself and act first, because I
I'm
had
right
been
there
in a
with you.
situation where someone is abusive and threatening me with my life because they're using, and it's not safe for me. So I've had to pull myself out of, and I've had to, dampen toxic relationships, and knowing that that's a risk, but that I tried, and my hand keeps getting slapped.
Mhm.
And at some point I have to say, okay, that relationship is toxic.
Yeah.
Nothing I do is right or works.
Right.
And I've done all I can.
Right.
And I've got to just pull myself. And I'm not going to lie to you. It's really hard.
It's
and
really hard. Yeah.
And the emotional struggle with that is.
Yeah. Because I've been there before, and what I have done in my situation is I've offered resources, and here's some resources, here's some therapists that come highly recommended, here's this organization, like literally spelling it out, phone number, this is what they help with, and I care about you, I love you, and I also need to take care of myself. And I also need to take care of myself, and my well-being matters as yours does. So I've been in that situation before, and I just wanted to hear from you with how you've navigated and what your advice was.
So if a woman locally is in that situation, I connect them with our local YWCA, because that's their focus is domestic abuse. And then they kind of have a pipeline, and they're of course aware that the person that is leaving will often be suicidal, and the other person can be as well. That is a theme that is common, and it's complicated.
And Moss, and this just made me think about this, because we talk about self-care, and you mentioned the oxygen mask in the airplane, of course, where they always tell the parents you need to put that on before the kids, which seems counterintuitive on one hand, but I recall a conversation where you and your husband had taken Charles to lunch at a restaurant, and I think you were outside, and he, in the middle of the meal, vomited on the ground and just like went back to eating like nothing had happened. And I think there were times where there would be sort of nodding off and different behaviors that you would see, and you weren't really sure what those indicated. But and you mentioned one of the first things that you had done was not maintain that self-care of going to the support group, which you mentioned is where you could have received answers to what some of these things were actually indicators of.
That's a huge regret. I've been putting the house on the market and really pouring myself into that. I've been working full time. So I told myself, I don't have time for support group. I gave up on the one thing that had been working for me at a time when I needed it the most. And I think part of that was I was feeling like I was failing. And I didn't want this group to see. That's all I can think of. The time constraint. I was just emotionally in a really difficult place. But I would tell people, don't isolate from the people who are most supportive and get what's going on. Because like you said, they could have told me, well, he's falling asleep in front of me. They would have known immediately. That's called the nods. It's from heroin. I had no idea what drug he was addicted to, because he was over 18 and he wouldn't sign any of the HIPAA forms that made us more informed. And it wasn't until the house manager called us and said that Charles is snorting heroin. I had no idea what drug he was doing. I had no idea how he was taking it.
Right.
Because, you know, they don't share that with you. So I felt really in the dark about so much. And I couldn't tell if it was a mental health issue or an addiction issue. And I was going to Families Anonymous, but that's where I was getting support. And I needed to continue. I've been going for 4 years. Why did I, at this last minute, not do it? Yeah. And so I tell people all the time, don't make my mistake. Please keep going to the people who are supporting you.
Well, and it's
They get
really
it.
important because they can also help identify some things that you might not realize. Like I know that he did not like needles, and so you know, like most of us might be ignorant to certain things. I mean, I think most people think that if someone's addicted to heroin, you're going to see tracks and needle marks. But if you had looked at
Spoons,
Charles, yeah,
candles, tinfoil.
right. But he
Yeah.
didn't do that.
No.
So, you know, you would not think if you didn't have people that could support you in a community to say, well, you don't have to see needle marks and to know that still could be a situation based on X, Y, and Z.
Right. I mean, somebody recently was telling me about their symptoms of their child. And they're like, do you think he's bipolar? And they were describing. I said, well, do you think he's smoking marijuana on a daily basis? She said, yes. And I said, that's probably where those behaviors are coming from. And she goes, well, doesn't that make you real docile and tired and just munchies? I'm like, you're talking about 70s marijuana, not today's marijuana, which is 7 times stronger. It triggers permanent psychosis, just all kinds of awful things in people.
Yeah.
Permanent brain damage that you can never reverse. And lots of times you can do meth for years, but you can come back from that. But marijuana, the one we think is innocent. So by her opening up that conversation with me, she found out additional information and found out it's probably that daily marijuana use that is triggering a lot of this disturbing behavior she was seeing. And I said, it's the drugs and not your child, because he wasn't like this before. So I think she started to feel a little bit better. But even if it had been like a mental illness, again, the person is in there and their illness sometimes takes over.
Yeah.
So it is kind of like they're this person, and this is kind of upsetting that personality that you love.
And I know we just have a few minutes left. This hour flew by, and we're really hoping to have you back on the show again because there's so much more that Tom and I would love to discuss with you. One of the things that I really wanted to emphasize that we touched on is the importance of listening to one another. Let's practice listening to one another, really tuning into what people are saying, even with their body language. I have so many parents that come to me that say, well, Tavia, my child just doesn't want to talk. They're just like, they're busy, they're doing this and they're doing that. And I'm like, and we keep trying. We keep trying and we keep leaving that door open to listen and to connect with them. Because I can't even tell you how many times like I pushed people away when I was younger. And I actually inside was like, I just want to be able to connect with them, but they just don't know how to connect with me. And so just keep trying
Right.
different approaches and keep leaving that space for listening.
I would add one thing to that. And I tell parents this every single time I meet with them is how can you expect them to be vulnerable when you're not vulnerable?
Yes.
So if you're not ever opening
Yeah.
up, if you're taking this authoritarian parenting, they're not going to open up until
Absolutely.
you start to open up.
Yep. Yeah. I practice that with my 8-year-old son. I'm very vulnerable with am very transparent. I call myself out on a whole bunch of things, and I just see mom messes up too. Mom makes mistakes. Mom does things that she's not proud of, but we have honest conversations about it, and it's really great. And I invite him to also share, and he does. He does share.
You're empowering him.
Yeah.
You know, what he says matters. And it's important to empower our kids by asking them their advice.
Yeah.
They come up with amazing advice. You would be surprised.
Oh, I get advice all the time from my son, Taylor. Yes, absolutely. And, I again want to emphasize this doesn't just apply to our youth. Y'all, this applies to everybody, listening, holding space for one another, and validating each other.
And a hug.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
What's been the organized religion's response, if there has been any, or I mean, how have you found? I'm just curious. Churches locally or nationwide, has there been any sort of response? Because I mean, a lot of people, I think a lot of issues that involve, and I know Tavia and I both see this ourselves with people that we work with, but that fear, shame, and guilt, there's a lot of roots sometimes in organized religion. And I'm just curious what your thought is on that, if you've seen anything one way or another.
Lately, in the last few years, they're inviting me in to speak to the community, not just their parishioners. And I've spoken a Catholic church here locally not long ago about this subject. And the minister wants, his parishioners are coming to him with this issue. So I think also I love it when I'm able to get in and train priests and ministers, and because that really helps them, guide them in the way they have those conversations as well. It's all about listening more and lecturing less, And then if they're coming to you, providing that faith message of support and not "you're going to burn in Hades" message, which is totally wrong. I mean,
but very common.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a lot less common today than it used to be.
Yeah.
So we're moving in that direction, and I have seen quite a bit of change since 2015 in that regard.
And Ann Moss, I'm sorry. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners before we close today?
I think the biggest thing is just really listen more. And if you feel that someone you love is struggling with thoughts of suicide, the only way to find out is say, "Are you thinking of suicide?" And then, "I'm listening. I really would like to support you."
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Ann Moss, for your time today. We hope to have you back on Connections with Tavia and The McClish in the near future.
And I have to say, your book, Diary of a Broken Mind, a mother's story, a son's suicide, and the haunting lyrics he left behind is just amazing. And I especially appreciated the audiobook because of the way that you say the lyrics to his songs. I mean, that's an amazing way to listen, is through the audiobook as well. But I really hope too, from institutional standpoint, that teachers and educators, as you point out, look at Emotionally Naked, a teacher's guide to preventing suicide and recognizing students at risk, because I mean, what's more important than that's where our kids are going to school and being acclimated to life, right? So and well, also, where else can people reach you? And I know that you have some ebooks and things.
I do. I have some free books, and they're at annmoss.com under resources. I have them on my speaker site, annmossrogers.com, and you go into books, and all the free ebooks are on my written books and paid books. But I have a ton about self-harm, 10 strategies to prevent us from dying by suicide. So I'm a big proponent of resources, and I have a lot of them out there free, and most of them are free. So, and I do a lot of professional development, a lot of presentations across the country. So anytime you need a speaker on mental health or suicide prevention, I hope you think of me.
Yes,
Oh, for sure.
absolutely. And we'll be sure to include all your links with the podcast. Thank you so much, Ann Moss. And we'll also be sure to include all the links here on Facebook and YouTube as well.
Excellent.
It was
Thank you
great
so much.
having you. Thanks so much.
Thanks
Take
so
good
much
care.
for having me. And I'm so sorry about your brother, Tavia. I really am.
Thank you, Ann Moss. And
Tavia.
it's
It's Tavia.
all good. And
Tomato, tomato.
I'm also very sorry about Charles. I mean, he sounds
Thank you.
like an amazing person. And
He
thank you
was.
so much for being so courageous and sharing your story with all of us and sharing about Charles, because what an amazing person.
He was.
Merry Christmas, Ann Moss.
Same
Merry
to you
Christmas,
all.
Ann Moss. Take
Thanks.
good care. Bye-bye.
Wow. Amazing.
Yes,
Whew. Yeah, a lot there.
right. Yeah,
And,
we'll be sure to add all of her links, and I'm really hoping that we can have her back on, Tom. There's so much more to dive into.
and Charles's YouTube channel, I encourage people to look at on YouTube. Charles Aubrey Rogers, absolutely amazing. The creative genius that was there is just beyond comprehension. I mean, is really mind blowing.
Yeah.
And again, this week having Twitch, who died by suicide. I mean, there's just it's just really sad, and I know that a lot of people, it's the people that remain, right? That I mean, there's so many people affected for something, as Ann Moss so aptly pointed out, is really a fleeting energy. It's a fleeting feeling, and yet so easy for people to take action on so quickly.
Yeah. I know that we have our upcoming show on the 25th, Christmas. I wanted
Absolutely.
to, before we wrap it up here today, Tom, I definitely wanted to let people know that we were going to be going live on Christmas and keeping our schedule. I will be there for part of the time, and Tom is going to be there for an extended part of the time. Is that correct? We got
It
a
is. So yeah,
lineup of interviews.
we'll be doing a 4-hour spread, and I think there's certain times of the year, and I think Christmas Day is one of them, where people who are alone, whether it's emotionally alone, whether they physically are alone, they've maybe grieving the loss of a loved one or a friend, or in the hospital due to a chronic illness, or maybe a terminal illness, or in a rehabilitation center. There's just a lot of I think significant, extraordinary feelings of real loneliness that sometimes it just helps to know that somebody cares, and hear a voice that might have some empathy to how that feels. So yeah, we'll be going on for 4 hours from, let's see, that would be 9 to 1 Pacific, and 11 to 3 Central. So
I think we altered the times just a little bit.
oh,
but
yeah, you're right. I'm
But
sorry.
we can
Well, right.
read about that and then share it with everybody. No problem.
Whatever, it's gonna be on at some point, right? So you can come in
Yeah.
whenever with some eggnog or
Yeah.
whatever, pumpkin pie. We'll be around somewhere during that time, so for sure.
Something that I really wanted to highlight too before we close today, Tom, is those that have lost somebody to suicide. And, Ann Moss was just sharing about this, the importance of reaching out for support and how essential it is, how important it is. And we don't even know necessarily until we go and we just stay open to the process and the unfolding of it. I can say confidently that I've seen both sides. I've seen people that have gone to therapy, like myself. I mean, I continue to go to therapy after my brother passed, and how supportive it has been for me, and how grateful I've been for my therapist and then other support systems that I have. I have amazing friends that I can connect with and talk to openly. And I've also seen, and I've seen this in other people as well. And I've also seen people that have not seeked support and don't really put themselves out there for those outlets. They don't have those outlets in place where they utilize on a consistent basis and make that known that you're my support for this, right? I need to come to you, I need to talk to you about this. I see how that affects people. And I see how losing somebody to suicide, how it runs them in the background, and how it affects their interaction with themselves, and it affects their interaction with others. And oftentimes I see that it creates a great disconnection because they're not processing, they're not honoring themselves and tending to themselves. There's frustration, there's anger, and rightfully so. Absolutely. I totally understand the anger part of it. Absolutely. Because I still have waves of anger. Um, and having a therapist, having my support system, and that outlet to be like, I'm angry today, or I'm really sad today. And it makes the world a difference. It helps me process and move through it instead of holding on to it and allowing it to steer my life in a direction that I don't want it to go in. That is not for my highest good. And therefore, it's not for the highest good of all. I'm affecting other people. So I'm really encouraging people that if you haven't seek support yet, and you're somebody that has lost somebody to suicide, please do. There are so many resources like NAMI. Here in Santa Cruz, we have suicide prevention, the Santa Cruz chapter. There are a ton of resources, and Tom and I will continue to share them on YouTube, on Facebook, on our podcast platforms. But there are a lot. And just remember that if you're feeling afraid to share and to open up about your personal experience of losing someone to suicide, there's other people out there just like you that are also feeling very scared to be vulnerable in that way. And sometimes just that moment of just opening up and sharing and being vulnerable, it could be so incredibly fulfilling and healing for ourselves to have that connection. So there's other people out there, but there's the option of like, we just go inward, we keep feeding into this, we keep letting it run us, we don't allow ourselves to process, or we give ourselves an opportunity to open up, to share with others, create connection, and create an opportunity for healing as well.
Well, we're hardwired to need community. I mean, we are just built that way. And so that's one of the things I loved about Ann Moss's vulnerability in the book Diary of a Broken Mind, because she was talking about certain signs and symptoms that her son Charles was exhibiting, like these nods and different things. And she also mentioned that he had a real fear of needles, and so he didn't use heroin in a way that most people think about. But she was just ignorant, as a lot of us are, about what those things are and how they look. And she said, the one thing I gave up on was the self-care, was
Yeah.
taking that oxygen mask. And it's the one thing that's the easiest for people to let slide, because it just feels like we don't want to honor ourselves either if we're dealing with a person, friend, or loved one that is dealing with substance abuse or has suicidal ideations. I mean, because we're always thinking, gosh, it's something else is more important than me. But the fact is that you can't give someone else what you don't already have to give.
Yep.
And
Absolutely.
if your tanks are not filled, if your tanks are empty, as well intentioned as you are, and as much as you want to help somebody, you can't do it. You don't have the resources available. If your bank account's negative, you can't give someone $10. As much as you'd like to,
Yeah.
you can't do that.
Yeah.
So we have to think about our emotional reserves and our emotional bank accounts and keep those tanks filled, because that's the only way that we can make a difference. And that requires that self-care and that self-awareness, and I'm going to use this word. It's a horrific word. It's the B word, benevolence. We have to be self-benevolent. And that's the hardest thing, I think, a lot of times for people to really do. And as Ann Moss said, when, push came to shove, it was easy to just push it aside. They're selling their house and they're doing everything else, and everything else
Right.
seemed more important. But in reality, It wasn't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else today, Tom, before we close?
No, I just want to encourage if people want to do a quick 5-minute share for Christmas Day,
Yeah.
whether again it's pertaining to grief scenario, loss of someone they might have had, or just to speak to the loneliness that people can have around that time, or as we've been talking about for the last few weeks, anxiety, stress, depression, right? Which again seem counterintuitive to the holiday, but man, it's everywhere. It's tough. It's really tough, and so here we are, but we welcome people to do a quick interview with both of us, you or me, individually, or however they want to do it. So we're definitely looking forward to Christmas Day, speaking to people, and
Yes.
having a hot cocoa, maybe an eggnog or two, and going from there.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thank you, Tom.
Great to
Thank
see
you,
you, Tavia.
everybody. Great to see you too. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today, and take good care.